So I will be the chair for the first session, and I would invite Christina Brown to the stage, who's going to talk about gender discrimination by managers. That's going to be a long presentation that is going to be followed by 2 short ones. It's good to have you here, Christina. I'll give you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to get to present this work here. Thank you so much to the organizers for putting this fantastic conference together. I'm extremely supportive of this initiative, and in particular, having it here in Lahore is very special because that's where this project got started. And I'm thrilled to be able to get your feedback, especially some of the things that I'm going to be talking about are with regards to gender discrimination, and especially as someone who's not, from this context, I would love to get your thoughts on whether the things that I'm going to show you from the research resonate with your own experiences, and whether you feel like this is, especially once we get to the mechanism section at the end of the paper, like, is this really, does this hold true, or does this feel reasonable given your experience in this context? Okay. So part of the original motivation for this research project was thinking about these really large gaps in terms of female labor force participation and wages in South Asia. So, I think most folks in the room are familiar with this issue. But there's been a lot of work even, outside of places with these big gender gaps, showing, evidence in the US of biases in the kind of personnel process. So at the stage of deciding on who gets hired, what wages are, who gets the raise, who gets promoted, there's evidence of bias at these different kind of junctures. But most of the kind of prior evidence thinking about mechanisms, typically the 2 explanations that you typically see are statistical discrimination, so that people tend to use group attributes in making decisions for an individual of whether to hire them or whether to give them a promotion based on their kind of group mean. The other kind of big channel of explanation is more taste-based discrimination, where people have specific biases against certain groups. And when we think about those 2 kind of more classic explanations, when you are looking at settings where women are actually the majority, so the paper today I'm going to talk to you about is in the teaching setting, where women are going to be the majority of our employees and actually half of our managers, it's harder to square both of those explanations, the taste-based discrimination and the statistical discrimination explanation, because these are places where women are the majority. So, why would it make sense necessarily for them also potentially to be discriminated against in that setting? And in teaching, we see that gender wage gaps are similarly large, ranging from kind of 11 to 35%. And so again, the kind of going into this project, I wanted to think a little bit about, in settings where women are the majority, why might we still see discrimination? Like, what could be the underlying sources that could explain that? And so the kind of high-level takeaway, what I'm going to try to provide evidence for you today, is that it could be that managers care about attributes other than productivity when deciding who to hire or who to give a raise to. There's been a growing literature recently on these kind of other social preferences that managers might have, or goals that they might be trying to achieve. And in particular, where this is going to be really relevant is managers' preference for redistribution to lower income households, which in this case is going to be highly correlated with employee gender. And so we're going to see that there's these kind of preferences for redistribution that could explain what looks like gender bias, but is really kind of preference for single earner households in particular. So 2 key research questions that I'm trying to answer with this paper. The first is more on the kind of policy side, which is, can we think about how different types of personnel policies, like how you provide raises to employees, how you monitor them, the extent to which those different policies might reduce the extent of discrimination versus might cause those discrimination to increase. So trying to think about really kind of what is the effect of these different policies on gender gaps.
And then what I'm going to hopefully be able to provide some evidence for is using these differences in personnel policies to try to think about what's the underlying mechanism for discrimination. Can we kind of use these policies as a lever to get kind of inside managers' heads and figure out how they're making their decisions of who to allocate resources to within the organization? So I did this partnership with a network of schools here in Pakistan, where we're going to be working with about 5,000 teachers and 200 managers across all of these different schools. The managers here are going to be like the school principal or vice principal. The two features of the performance system that we're going to vary is, one, whether the manager's annual performance evaluation has a financial stake for the employee. So in some cases, they're going to do their kind of standard annual performance review, and it's just going to be for feedback for the employee or part of their personnel records. But in other schools, that annual performance review score is what's going to determine that teacher's raise at the end of the year. The other thing that we're going to vary is how much information managers have about their employees. So how much time they actually get to spend doing classroom observations and kind of how accurate they're going to end up being in terms of their evaluation of their employees. So these are the two features of the kind of personnel system that we're going to vary. And then we're going to measure outcomes all along the causal chain to really understand, can we say something about employee effort, so kind of controlling for really rich measures of teachers' productivity? Are there actually gaps in the wages that men versus women are earning? And we'll be able to kind of disentangle some of the mechanisms using data from the performance evaluation system, where we'll have really detailed information on how these employees were evaluated, what their scores were, as well as some surveys from managers and teachers, again, to try to get at some of these mechanisms. Okay. So really briefly, for those of you who are jet lagged and won't make it paying attention to the end of this presentation, the high level results are that when we look at teachers' evaluation scores, their performance evaluation scores in this system, and we control for really rich measures of teacher productivity. So we have like minute by minute clock in time, because we can see them. They have to scan in with their thumbprint. We know exactly when they're in the school. We have 6,000 hours of classroom footage that we've coded using a classroom observation rubric. So we have really detailed information in terms of what teaching strategies teachers use. And we can calculate teacher value added. When we control for all of those kind of really rich measures of what teachers are doing in the classroom, we find that when this evaluation score has a financial stake, women get significantly lower scores. So when this manager has to do this annual performance evaluation, rating this teacher, women are getting much lower scores, again, controlling for everything that we can see about teacher productivity, which is obviously not everything, but is a pretty rich set of controls. However, importantly, when there's no financial stakes of this evaluation, so when it's just for feedback, part of their annual performance evaluation, then we see almost no difference in the scores men and women are getting, right? So when there's money on the line associated with this score, we see this gap. But when I'm just supposed to be evaluating your quality as a teacher, almost no gap between men and women. Right, so this is a little bit of a interesting story, right? It's not necessarily that managers, think women are worse teachers, because when there's no money on the line, we're seeing that they're giving them very similar scores. The other interesting pattern that we see is that when we force managers to spend more time with their employees, so in this case, this is doing more classroom observations and getting having a more accurate picture of what teachers are doing, that also significantly reduces this gender gap. So it seems like even when there's financial stakes, if I know who is the better teacher, right? Like I know with certainty this individual is better, then it doesn't seem like these biases kind of creep in. So you both need financial stakes plus not great information about your employees in order for these biases to occur. So trying to kind of square those results, the framework that we have in mind is one that's a little bit different than the traditional kind of statistical and taste-based discrimination explanations. We're going to make some kind of basic assumptions of shutting down a lot of the main channels that you might see discrimination coming in through and kind of setting ourselves up for like a best case scenario. So we're going to assume that there's no difference in means or the variance in productivity between men and women. I'll show you some evidence in the data that seems like a reasonable assumption. And we're also going to assume that kind of managers don't have explicit bias. I think that this is like almost certainly a simplification. I think that there's probably some bias that managers either explicitly or implicitly have. But we're going to kind of shut down that channel and assume that that's not the main driver here. And instead, what we're going to say is that managers don't have perfect information about their employees' productivity, and they may have some different kind of cost to giving low raises to certain groups. So this could be because, maybe if I give a low raise to someone, I think that they might leave, right? And that's going to be a pain for the manager. I then have to hire someone new. Or maybe I just feel bad for a certain individual. I know that they're really struggling financially, and so I don't want to give a lower raise to them because I know this is going to have, costs for their household. So I'm going to basically assume that, I don't have perfect information about my employees' quality, and there might be these different costs to giving low raises to certain individuals. And the combination of those two things is going to give us these disparate outcomes by gender. And so then in terms of mechanisms, so that's kind of the framework we're going to have in mind. I kind of floated to you that there's kind of two buckets of possible explanations for why managers might feel that it's more costly to them to give lower raises to men versus women. One bucket of explanations is kind of this differences in perceived deservedness. So this idea, for example, that I, as the manager, might know that some of my employees are really struggling financially. Maybe they're the sole earner for their household, or I might know that this person's spouse is also a doctor and their household is doing okay, or things like that. So I might have this information, and that might influence kind of my sense of which of these households is more deserving of a slight increase in financial resources. And in particular, what we're going to see, unsurprisingly, is that total household income is going to be very highly correlated with employee gender, because if I have a female teacher in my school, there's a very high likelihood that her husband works, and if he works, he probably earns more than a teacher's salary, or equivalent. Whereas if I see a male employee, there's a very high likelihood his spouse does not work, or if she does work, she's earning less than a teacher's salary. So if I look at kind of the average household income for these two individuals, there's going to be this big, very strong correlation between gender and total household income. The other kind of bucket of explanations is this idea that managers might expect men versus women to respond differently to a low raise. Maybe I think that men are more likely to try to look for another job, or maybe they just might complain and kind of make my life a little bit harder as the manager, and I don't really want to deal with that. So that's another bucket of explanations. In general, we're going to find evidence in support of this first bucket of explanations and less evidence for this second bucket, though I will say I don't think it's necessarily that we can completely shut down this channel, but in general, we're going to find more evidence in support of the first mechanism. Okay. So just very briefly, in thinking about kind of where I hope this paper can make a contribution, the first is that there's quite a bit of work on the extent of gender discrimination. And what I think is kind of unique about the findings that I'll show you here is that a lot of the previous work on gender has really thought about this idea that maybe I think a lot of people have biases on women's proficiency in STEM settings, or their ability to do well in computer science, and so the bias there is about the woman's kind of productivity or quality, right? It's really about bias related to productivity. Here, what we're showing is that when there's no financial stakes, managers are evaluating women and men very similarly, right? So when it's just about evaluating worker productivity, we're not really seeing much evidence of bias. It's only when there's this financial stake associated with it, right? When there's money on the line, that's where this bias comes in. And that feels like a very different type of bias or discrimination than bias about this woman's quality as an employee. The other contribution is that the way that in other work on discrimination, both in thinking about racial and gender discrimination, typically the way that information ends up playing a role is that it kind of crowds out statistical discrimination. So by that I mean that once I know for certain, the quality of this worker, I don't need to rely on group attributes to make an assessment about this person because I have perfect information about that individual. That's actually not the role that information is playing in this setting. Instead, it's that it's kind of crowding out my ability to show this financial favoritism. That, once I know with certainty, okay, Zahra is a better teacher than Mansoor, then I can't really, have these other things that kind of crowd my decision of who to give a higher raise to. So that's ends up being the channel that information plays here. The last contribution is in this kind of recently burgeoning literature on the other kind of social preferences that managers might have in making decisions within the firm. So there's been some other work showing that managers really care about giving, like this preference for giving work as opposed to giving cash transfers. As well as other work suggesting that managers might really care about the safety of their female employees on the job and things like this. So there's other things that they're kind of trying to maximize beyond just profits, right? There's other things that they care about when they're deciding, who to hire or who to give a raise to. And in this case, it's looking like managers are going to really be thinking about the household's total income potentially and wanting to redistribute to lower income households or single earner households. Let me pause really quickly there as I've kind of gone over the main high level results. I'll go into all this in a lot more detail, but any clarification questions or big picture questions at this stage? Yes.
Thanks, Christina. Are these private schools or public?
They're private schools.
So when you typically talk about race-based discrimination or statistical discrimination, there's a profit motive because of which you are either relying on group averages. So what is it in this setting? So I'm thinking, like, should I think about male teacher having a higher outside option, and I'm worried that they're going to leave, and that's why I'm paying them more. So then it is statistical discrimination again, no?
Yeah, so this is a really good point. And we're going to put that into the bundle of kind of those second mechanisms exactly, that managers might be correct in their assessments that there's maybe a different turnover for men versus women if I give them a lower raise, and if it takes time for me to hire a new teacher or things like that, if employers have some monopsony power, then right, I want to hold on to those employees. So we're going to find less evidence for that channel. The way that we're going to do this is we're going to basically have some exogenous variation in the raise that you get in a given year. And it doesn't look like men versus women have a higher turnover rate. So in general, when you get a lower raise, you're more likely to turn over, but that's the magnitude is similar for men versus women. It could be that managers don't realize that, but we do some surveys with managers to try to get at this of like, what are their beliefs about the differential turnover rates? And it looks like it's not too different. But I think that was going into it was one of the key potential mechanisms that we thought about, but it looks like there's not as much evidence for that, at least in this setting. Yes.
So, in some settings, especially in other provinces, I've seen that female workers also focused more on the workspace environment.
Yeah.
For example, they would prefer to have safe transportation, safe workspace, like clean bathrooms, and their own workstation, which they would, very lovingly decorate and keep it.
Yeah.
Whereas men, colleagues wouldn't care so much about like transportation or the workspace. They would just, focus more on the financial gains. that can be also one factor if your study considers.
Yeah, this is really interesting. And the the evidence that I'm going to show you is basically all, amongst existing people who have chosen to work in these schools. But I do think that there is this interesting point that women versus men might have different amenity preferences, and that might change the type of people who want to work in these jobs. What's going to, I think it's coming pretty soon, but what's going to be really interesting too is that you might imagine, because of those different preferences, maybe the quality of workers is different for men versus women who are in these schools. But it's actually going to look like it's quite similar. So I'll just in a couple slides have a little more evidence to kind of show you what the distribution of quality look like for men versus women. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering that these principals probably know the teachers quite well.
Yes.
Because they're from the same locality and so on. I was just wondering, are there teachers in your data set that are sole earners in the household? I don't know what the proportion would be, but I mean, looking at your results, you would expect that the gap is at least smaller for those teachers.
Yeah, this is a really great point. In our data, we don't know detailed information about the household's income, but we're going to have two things to try to overcome that data challenge in our main sample. One is that we have teachers' age, and we're going to find that these results don't really hold for very young teachers who are likely to be single, just starting out, don't have kids. These effects are kind of biggest in the age 30 to 50, where you would expect them to be married, to be supporting a family. So that's kind of pointing in this direction that could be the case. Then we're also going to go and do a follow-up like vignette exercise where we're going to present managers with different kind of profiles of people, and there we're specifically going to vary how we describe the household of the teacher, and we'll be able to show that it's loading on, that it's not about men versus women, but at least in the vignette study, it's about two earner versus single earner households. Yes.
This is understanding. I was just thinking about the public sector in Pakistan, evaluation. It's called annual confidential report. There are three officers involved in it. As per my own understanding and experience, the annual confidential report or evaluation is not linked with the financial incentive which you are talking about. So there is a reporting officer, there is a senior officer, and the competent authority, which is usually a secretary. So I was just wondering how your research, which you mentioned is in the public sector in Pakistan, is correlating your finding with this system, which is very much graded. You have a grade 16, 17, 18, and after a certain year, you will be promoted based on your annual confidential report and the seniority.
Yeah, really great question. So the schools that we're working with for the study are private schools. That's partly why we were able to even have some financial link between the performance evaluation and their raise at the end of the year. Hopefully I'll get some time at the end to kind of take a step back and say, what do we think we can learn then for public schools when there's not a financial stake of these evaluations? It's going to be suggestive evidence, at least, that that's maybe good in that we can maybe trust these evaluation scores a little bit more when there's no financial stake. But the downside of that is that there's less of an incentive to kind of work harder in response to these performance evaluation scores, which does end up being an important motivator for teachers in these schools. But hopefully I'll get time to talk a little bit about implications for public schools. Okay, so just very briefly, again, because, even though this is done in Pakistan, because we're working with teachers, in general, there's very high level of acceptance for women in working and teaching. And when we're thinking about kind of wage gaps in general for women, because teaching is such a big sector for educated women, I think it's a really important setting to kind of think about these questions. So first off, I just want to kind of level set about these schools and our managers. In general, they're quite gender progressive. These are higher fee private schools. The kind of cater of managers and teachers is quite good overall. So if anything, we have quite positive selection in terms of who these managers are. And if you're wanting to work in education, you kind of know that you're going to be working with lots of other women, right? Like that's kind of going to be known. And so we think that probably the people that select into these jobs are going to be more accepting of women in the workplace. This data is showing you response to one of the world values survey questions. When jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women. And if you look at the general South Asia sample in the world values survey, you see that most people are much more gender conservative. Our sample is the blue bars, and so you see that they look kind of similar to an OECD sample in terms of gender progressiveness. Now, it could be that they just didn't feel comfortable responding to this question as part of the survey, but we also do some other follow-up work that's like a little bit more subtle in trying to get at their gender attitudes. And in all of those measures as well, it does look like our managers are relatively gender progressive. The other thing that's interesting, and even though, as others have pointed out, that we expect that the type of women that go into these jobs versus the type of men that go into these jobs might be very different, and their preferences for amenities might be very different. Their actual productivity is very, very similar. So this first graph is showing you the distribution of years of experience for men versus women. The lines are a little bit light, but you see that it's almost identical for men versus women. This graph is showing you our value-added measures using year-over-year test scores, controlling for 2 years of baseline test scores. And so, again, we're seeing very, very similar distributions in terms of teacher quality for men versus women. Their daily attendance is almost identical. The only thing that's different is that we see that women are getting slightly higher observation scores on our classroom observation rubric, and that's mostly coming from the components related to kind of positive classroom climate, relationship between students and teachers. Women tend to do a little bit better on those dimensions of the rubric, but on all other aspects, they're looking very, very similar in terms of how we can measure productivity. Okay, so we're setting ourselves up for their productivity looks similar. Our managers are relatively gender progressive. How might we still see disparate outcomes for men versus women? Just since we're running a little bit short on time, I won't spend too much time on the model. If you're curious, happy to send you the more detailed paper. But the framework here that we have in mind is basically that I'm a manager, I'm trying to decide what performance evaluation score to give to my employee. And I'm going to get some information about their quality, but it's not going to be perfect. And so then the two things that I'm going to trade off in deciding what score to give them is that I'm going to have some cost to me as the manager if I'm inaccurate. So you could think of this, right, as just like I, as the manager, want to try to be as honest as possible. I also want people to believe this score, right? I want them to be working harder in response to this score. And so I have an incentive for people to take this seriously and to think that I'm being honest in my assessments. The other cost that I'm going to face is that in general, employees don't like low raises, right? And so I'm going to face a cost when I give someone a low raise. And that cost could be different by gender. This could either be because there's differential turnover if I give a low raise to a male versus female employee. Maybe I just feel guilty, like I just feel bad about it, right? I know this person, I know their financial circumstance at home. That could be different by gender and so on. So these two things are kind of going to be the tension that managers are going to face, that they want to try to be as accurate as possible, but they still are going to feel maybe bad or worry about giving low raises to certain individuals. And so it's going to be this combination of the fact that, that I have imperfect information about my employees, plus in some schools, there's going to be a financial stake that's going to really give us our leverage to detect any sort of discrimination. Okay, so we did this in partnership with a network of private schools. They're spread out all over Pakistan, and we're going to be working with teachers in upper primary and secondary schools in core subjects. And as I mentioned, I think this is a really nice setting to think about female labor force participation and wage gaps, because it's such an important sector for educated women in South Asia. Okay. So the experiment that we're going to do with schools, for all teachers across all of the schools in our sample, there was this existing performance evaluation system that had existed for years before I got involved with them, where they do this annual performance evaluation and score their teachers. In some schools, that annual performance evaluation score is going to determine what that teacher's raise is. And so their raise is going to vary from 0 to 10% at the end of the year based on that score. In the other schools, that performance evaluation score is just going to be for feedback. And instead, their raise is either going to be predetermined, that they get 5% no matter what, or their raise is going to be based on their students' test scores. So the focus in terms of like how do teachers respond differently to objective incentives versus subjective incentives, so their manager's evaluation of them versus no incentives, that's the focus of a separate paper, but we're also going to use the same variation then to look at what happens to managers' scores. So we're going to be exploiting this school level variation. And then we're going to have some teacher level variation where we told managers, we randomly selected some teachers for them to do more frequent classroom observations. We also wanted them to do them with like no notice given to teachers, so really dropping in and doing these unannounced classroom observations. This ends up increasing the number of observations that teachers get by about 50%. So even for the control, managers still do some classroom observations, but this significantly increases the amount. In terms of timeline, so we're going to go in and do a baseline survey before the year. The performance evaluation system follows the calendar year. So at the beginning in January, all teachers are going to sit down with their manager and basically see what criteria they're going to be used to be evaluated that year. Managers are allowed to set different criteria for different employees, and they do this in practice, where like maybe for a very inexperienced teacher, maybe I have very basic criteria that I set, whereas for a very senior teacher, I'm going to expect them to maybe do some mentoring or help with other things in the school and so on. So they're allowed to kind of tailor this to each of their employees. So we're going to announce to them what their treatment status is, so whether this evaluation, performance evaluation score matters for their raise or not. And then they're going to sit down and set these criteria. We're then going to collect lots of data on teachers' productivity from their clock in and out data. We're going to do a large videotaping exercise to try to measure their teaching strategies. And then these additional observations that managers are going to be doing happen basically in the couple months leading up to this end of year evaluation score that managers are then going to fill out. We'll go in and do a set of tests with students. This is the test that's going to determine for the objective performance pay schools what teachers' raises, as well as serve as some of our end-line outcomes, and then the raises will be told to teachers, and we'll do a follow-up survey. Because we want to try to get at like are women versus men getting lower wages, we really want to know kind of controlling for productivity, right? Like if we see differences in wages, it doesn't really matter as much if it's the case that their women's versus men's productivity is just very different, and that's what's explaining what's going on. So as much as possible, we wanted some sort of ground truth about what were these employees' productivity. So that's going to come from our videotaping data, the value-added measures that we have, and our clock in and out time. Those are going to be our three main components for measuring productivity. And then we'll have lots of helpful follow-up data from managers to try to get at what are the underlying mechanisms that explain our results. I think I'll skip this, but our sample, I would say, looks, kind of as you might expect for Pakistan, in that our teachers are mostly female. It's going to be about 80%, whereas our managers are about half and half, just slightly over half are female. Okay, so first thing, just to kind of think about what might these treatments be doing, and does it seem like they worked or teachers understood them? So when there's a financial stake of the performance evaluation score, we see that teachers work much harder than when there's a flat raise, everyone gets the same. So it looks like teachers are kind of responding to these incentives. And we see, increases in test scores, increases in attendance, increases in other non-test score outcomes for students. So yay, economics incentives work. So that's kind of happening in the background. The other thing is that when managers spend more time doing classroom observations, they're more accurate in their assessments of their teachers, right? They just have better information about the quality of their employees. But you might be worried that these treatments are doing other things that kind of might meddle in our interpretation of how we're thinking about these evaluation scores. So one thing in particular you might be worried about is that when there's no financial stake of the performance evaluation, maybe managers just don't really care about this, right? They fill out the scores really quickly. They don't spend any time thinking about it. And so it's hard to really compare the scores across these two because in one case, they just weren't taking it very seriously. We try the best that we can to try to suss out whether that's the case. When we look at the details, so we can actually see the text of the evaluation criteria that managers use, as well as the individual kind of sub-scores on all of these different criteria. And it doesn't look like when there's no financial stakes of the evaluation score that principals are more likely to use like round numbers, or that there's less kind of within teacher or within manager variance. We can see how many characters they use for the actual written criteria, and that doesn't vary across treatment status either. So in the measures that we can have, it doesn't look like they're any less diligent in the process. The other thing that I think helps here is that this was an existing performance evaluation system that existed in the school system prior to our involvement with it. And so it wasn't that we were kind of coming in and introducing something new. This was something that they were very used to doing and that they take quite seriously within the organization. Okay, so jumping into the main results. So first off, as I previewed, what I'm going to show you here is basically I'm converting the teacher's evaluation score into what the raise amount in dollars would have been had there been a financial stake. So in the case where there's no financial stakes, I'm going to basically convert it into a dollar value, just so that it's kind of comparable between these two and we can put some real money on it. And what I'm showing you here is what is the average raise that men versus women are getting when they're in the schools that were randomly assigned to have their manager's evaluation score be the thing that determines their raise. The results I'm showing you here are controlling for a double lasso selection of controls, but I can also try basically keeping all of the controls in for productivity. I can do this without any controls for productivity, and the results look very, very similar in terms of this gap. It changes by like a couple percentage points. So then what happens to their effective raises or their evaluation score when there's no financial stakes? Well, we see that gap closes almost completely, right? There's almost no difference between men and women's effective raise. Had this been what determined their raise. I will say, just to be clear about kind of what this is representing, in these cases, their actual raise is either the 5% or based on their students' test scores. So this is showing what their raise would have been had we used their principal's evaluation score of them. Okay. So, big difference kind of closing this gap. The other interesting pattern here is that this isn't just driven by male managers. We see this amongst both male and female managers. Managers with more experience, managers in our measure, that world value survey question of kind of gender progressiveness or conservativeness. We see this amongst both gender progressive and gender conservative managers. The other interesting pattern is comparing for teachers who were observed more frequently versus observed less. So in our control group, again, we see this big gap in the effective raise that men versus women are getting. But when I now know, who is the better teacher, that closes the gap almost completely, right? Really big reduction in the gap between men versus women. I can put both of these together. So we have, teachers who were had financial stakes and not, and then the observation treatment and not. And what you really see is it's only really this group where the gap is there, right? So you both need financial stakes plus no information or limited information for the manager in order for these gaps to emerge. And as I mentioned, we don't see differences by manager gender. I will say though, for those results, like the confidence intervals are pretty wide. So, I can't reject reasonable size differences between the two, but hopefully that's not me. No, significant differences that we can suss out. Okay. So as a few of you have highlighted so far, I think there's a couple potential mechanisms that could explain this result of why we see these different patterns in terms of evaluation by managers. One is this kind of expectation that maybe men versus women respond differently to a low raise, right? Maybe they're more likely to turn over. Maybe just, I really rely on my teachers to help with after-school activities or other administrative tasks. And I think that men versus women might be, more likely to reduce their contribution to those other kind of school public goods. So there could be lots of things that, practically make my job harder as a manager and that I'm cognizant of, and that's really how I'm thinking about these things and who to give a higher evaluation score to. The other bucket of explanations is on this sense of differential deservedness, that it's not really about gender, it's that I'm preferencing single earner versus two earner households, and that just happens to be highly correlated with gender. So that's kind of the other bucket of explanations. To try to test these different mechanisms, I went back and did a follow-up set of surveys, this time actually in public schools. Partly what I wanted to do was get a separate set of managers that hadn't had any experience with having performance evaluations that are tied to financial stakes. So they've done some evaluations of teachers, but it's never been tied to the teacher's wage previously. And so this helps, I think, in the activities that we do with them just come from a little bit of a fresh perspective. So the activity that we do with managers, so this is with a separate set of managers, go back a couple years later actually to do this exercise. And what we're going to show them is these different profiles of teachers with different attributes. We're going to say things about, what class and subject they're teaching, their overall classroom environment quality, how much leave they're taking, how much experience you've had or interacted with them. And then the very last line here is we list what their spouse's job is. So kind of, throwaway at the end, we include this. And then across the survey subjects, we vary how we frame this activity. This is all a hypothetical activity, so this isn't real money on the table. But we say we want you to think about this exercise, pretend you're this person's manager, rank kind of where you would rate these different teachers, and imagine in this ranking exercise either that this score would affect the teacher's pay for the next year, or this score will not affect the teacher's salary or promotion opportunities. We also frame whether it would be as if you would have to kind of tell the teacher what the score is, or it wouldn't be revealed that you were the person who made the decision. And again, this is all hypothetical. This is just how we kind of frame the activity to the person. And so then they have to do this ranking. So they saw the 3 different profiles, and they have to say, which of them would they put in the top, middle, and bottom. And then we also ask them for a few profiles. We say, like, okay, imagine you gave the low score to this teacher. What do you think would happen? The teacher, how likely would it be that they complain, that they would suffer a financial hardship, and so on? I will say that, this is a vignette exercise with teachers. There's no stakes associated with it. So I think for all of these tests, I would say that this is a very conservative test of the mechanisms. I'm going to show you that we have evidence for some mechanisms and not for others, but I don't want to say that's necessarily that other mechanism could never exist, because it could just be that the data that we've collected just isn't strong enough to kind of pick up some of these channels. It was also part of a larger survey and engagement that we did with these principals. So I think it helped too that we were kind of working with them in the long run, and that this survey was kind of unrelated directly to gender. The project that we were doing in these public schools was not related to gender at all. It was a totally different education project. And we framed this exercise basically as we're trying to understand what managers value in their teachers, right? What do you actually care about as a manager? Which of these things is important to you? And so that's how they thought about this exercise. Okay. So first on that bucket of explanations related to differential response. So do managers expect that men versus women are more likely to respond differently? We don't find too much evidence of this. So this is showing you how likely to agree or disagree with the different statements of that the person would complain, would help less at the school, would job hunt, and so on, for male versus female named profiles. And we don't see much of a difference in terms of their expected response to these things. We also don't see too much of a difference, maybe a little bit of something here on whether they'd feel bad for the teacher or feel good about the decision. Now, importantly, in this sample, we balanced it in terms of the spouse's job characteristics too. So here we have a lot of single earner women and dual earner men too. So this is basically holding fixed the spouse's status and just looking at variation by the gender name. The other thing at the very end, we kind of just ask explicitly, like, okay, in general, for your teachers, who is more likely to complain if they receive a low raise? And we don't see much in terms of, a few say male teachers, a few say female teachers, a lot are in the middle. This isn't just because the managers are just like, yeah, no, everyone's good, there's no difference. They do say that very senior teachers are much more likely to complain. So, they are willing to admit that there are differences. So I think that helps to kind of, assuage that this isn't completely response bias. The other thing to the point about turnover is that we can look in the existing administrative data on historical turnover rates in the schools. And what I do is I exploit the fact that because the way this evaluation system works is it's actually like a relative tournament within your school. So as a manager, I can only allocate so many A scores, so many B scores, C scores, D scores, E scores, and in doing this evaluation score. If you happen to get a very good teacher that moved into your school, that then serves as like a negative shock to your own score in the following year. So we can use that as an instrument for you getting a low score in that year and look at are men versus women more likely to turn over. We see that both men and women do have an increased turnover when they get a low raise, but it's not differential by gender. Okay. So then the other kind of bucket of explanations is around this differential deservedness idea. And first I just want to show you, so this is coming from the PSLM looking, restricting to the sample of secondary school teachers in all of Pakistan. And this is showing you what was their spouse's income. Here I'm including zeros only if you're married and have a non-working spouse, and here I'm including zeros either if you're single or have a non-working spouse. And the key thing that you see is that the average spousal income for women is just much, much higher than for male teachers, right? If you're a male teacher, it's very high likely that your wife doesn't work or she's not earning as much as the female teacher's spouses. So, big differences when we're thinking about if I see a female versus a male teacher, what is their total household income? So then the one thing that we do see from this vignette data is that, so we're asking teachers to do this rating. Encouragingly, when we frame the activity as, the score won't affect your pay, we see that when the profile has spouse working versus spouse doesn't working, we see no difference in the score that they're giving these two different profiles, which is encouraging. But then when we do frame this exercise as affecting the worker's pay, we see that profiles that have their spouse listed as not working are now getting higher scores, right? And this is just in a hypothetical exercise that when we frame it as this, being related to the person's wages, that we see that these profiles are getting higher scores. So I think this is a pretty, conservative test. Like I wouldn't have been surprised if we didn't see anything. Maybe they just weren't paying close enough attention to the vignettes and so on. So the fact that we do see something here, I think is quite interesting. Also, when we ask explicitly who is more likely to suffer financially, we do see that they're more likely to say that male teachers are more likely to suffer financially if they get a low raise. And then to this point that came up earlier, sadly, in our main RCT sample, we don't know what the total household income is of the staff members, but we can split this by age, and we see the effects are really concentrated for folks aged 30 to 50, where we would expect them to be raising a family. The last test that we can do is using another set of data. This was it had data both on wages. It does have marital status of the teachers, and it's in both public and private schools, and we can control for value added. And what's helpful here is we can kind of basically exploit this variation in public schools with the fact that in public schools, there's not a lot of scope for schools to kind of adjust wages for these different things, whereas in private schools, the manager has a lot of discretion in how wages are set, so they could potentially give different wages to men versus women. And so what this is allowing us to show is basically that we're really seeing this negative effect of for married versus non-married women just in the private schools, right? So in the places where people actually can adjust the wage to the different circumstance, you see this difference in wages, whereas in the public schools, it's less so. Okay. So wrapping up just in terms of the takeaways, I think that this brings up a few interesting areas potentially for future work for those in the audience, especially the students. I think that this idea that employers or managers might really care about other preferences like redistribution is very interesting, especially in settings with very low income taxes, right? It could be that it's just kind of acceptable as a society that this is how we redistribute, that managers have this authority to kind of make these decisions, and it's not as much about profit maximization, but also these other social goals that we expect firms to take on. And I also think this has really brought up this interesting point that because oftentimes gender and total household income is very correlated, especially in South Asia, but even if you look in the US, household income per capita is 19% higher for female versus male married employees within a given occupation and sector. So this correlation between total household income and gender still exists. Like I would love to be able to include some of these controls in other work related to gender to see how much of it is really loading on this total household income piece. I also think this brings up this interesting kind of sticky equilibrium where women are kind of double penalized for working, right? Both you earn less when you're working, but also your husband could be penalized if you enter the labor force, right? So that could be an important reason for why women are entering the labor force. And especially if this is a kind of important social goal that managers feel like they're trying to achieve, that this isn't really a nuisance, right? It's not that, oh, I know that men are more likely to turn over, or I know that men are more likely to complain. Here, these managers care about achieving these social goals, and so it's not really something that they're going to want to think about at the hiring stage, for example. This isn't a pain that they have to deal with. This is something that they're kind of happy to be able to provide for these individuals. So I think it presents this very interesting pattern. I'll leave it there. I want to give a special shout out to the fantastic team at SERP that made this happen, including two people who are currently in the audience that have their pictures there. So thank you so much to that fantastic team, and looking forward to questions. Yes, please. Oh, sure.
My name is Arslan Islam Chaudhry. I am HR analytical professional, and two relevant your practices about the performance appraisal. What you think about the looking at the future, the HR analytical KPIs, the most important key performance appraisal, and what you think about AI era and automation to prevent the managerial level and the South Asia level. How can you tackle gender discriminations in schools, especially in public sector and private sector? What do you think about that? What is the remedy as a policymaker?
Great.
What you suggest? Ji, thank you.
Maybe I'll take like 2 or 3 questions together, and then I'll try to see if I can remember all of them. Yes.
Thank you, Christina. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm a faculty in the economics department here at LUMS. My name is Aisha. I had a question about the mechanisms. So you find evidence for the sort of deservedness mechanism, but not so much for the turnover or sort of complaining and looking for another job. So, my comment is, and I think you did kind of allude to this as you talked about it, and we're looking at, in your vignette survey, we're looking at public schools where sort of having contractual teachers is not very common. So these, teachers would have sort of a lot of job security, and they've probably selected into this sector as well. So maybe we're less likely to find evidence for that particular mechanism in this sort of sample that you're looking at. So, just to kind of, maybe highlight what you're already sort of thinking about.
So I have a question. So thanks for the excellent talk. So I have a question about the initial framework you presented in which the manager is deciding based on a quality signal YI and discretion. So I was just wondering if you change the weights, how that changes the outcomes, and if there was any, and what were the assumed weights in the study itself. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I'll take those and then we can do another batch of questions. So on this idea of kind of KPIs, and I don't know if I can speak much to the AI component, but it does suggest from these results that information is really important for managers and might serve as a way to kind of crowd out this other discrimination, right? So the more accurate information you can give to managers, especially I think in the setting, this idea that managers want to make the best decision possible, but when they just don't know who is the better employee, they might rely on these other characteristics. And so like potentially having really well done KPI systems or better data feeding to managers could potentially be very helpful in those settings. To the point about public schools too, I do agree that because there is not a lot of scope for managers to have kind of any differential say or wages are set according to these very strict criteria. We have a similar system in the US, and the origin of that actually was because of racial and gender concerns that people we're seeing that teachers were getting much lower, Black teachers were getting much lower wages, and so there was this idea that we need to set these standardized wage schedules, and so it should just be based on experience, for example. So there's a lot of benefits to that standardization from reducing discrimination. The downside is that, as I show in the other paper that's looking at the effect of subjective versus objective incentives, you do reduce the overall kind of effort of your employees when there's no financial stakes associated with performance, and so that there's kind of this tension potentially between providing better incentives and the extent of discrimination. What's slightly encouraging is the kind of combination here, which is if managers are well informed, it's okay to have financial stakes. It's okay to have incentives because then they're at least making kind of a good decision. So it's not that you necessarily always have to scrap the incentive component. There are potential ways to kind of combine these two things to make it work. On the waiting for the framework, I actually don't apply an explicit weight. Instead, what I do is I basically have managers solve like an optimization problem where they're deciding how much weight to place on the information that they have versus these other things. And it comes from essentially like the utility. If I had different utility functions, then they would end up putting different weights, but it ends up being like an optimization problem that they're solving. But happy to chat more to you about how to set that up and if there's other ways that we should address it. Great. I think I can take one more batch of questions. Yes.
So, Christina, I've been trying to work out whether the paper is really about gender or deservedness.
Yep.
And you say that, look, in this context, the two are very highly correlated. And that kind of fits in with a long line of labour literature where we know there's a marriage premium. And you kind of alluded to that on the penultimate slides. I've never seen too much work to look at whether the marriage premium is differential between men and women. I suspect that it's much larger for men, that when they have a change in their family circumstances, employers take that as a differential signal. But is that really the bottom line here, that this is another example of managers taking account of family circumstances, and that's what we mean by deservedness? It's really got nothing to do with gender. If we observed the opposite setup, then we would observe The only sort of caveat to that is that the bonuses seem to be decided right at the start of a period of high aggregate uncertainty. So is that where sort of maybe gender is coming back in, that men are seen to be more deserving in very uncertain times?
That's a really good point. I don't have variation across different time periods. Sorry, actually, maybe I'll take a couple more questions and then I think there was one and then do Kate.
Hi, this is Salman from IBA Karachi. Do you think the discrimination of a married female in a private school might be due to self-selection? Because I've seen if you're a married woman and still working in a private school, you are more likely to be desperate, and there there might be features that are correlated with uh, teaching quality. So, do you think it might be due to that?
Hi, Christina. Since I have the mic here,
Where am I looking?
I'm here.
Oh, there. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah, wonderful paper, great presentation. I just wanted to ask whether you have any measure of, I don't know if it's like friendship, proximity, etc., between the manager and the teachers, because my sense is that the response bias mechanism could be stronger for that group that's closer to, like, when the two are closer. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks. It's super exciting work. So 2 questions about norms. One, do you know how much they're observing to begin with, and that why wouldn't they be observing more in the first place? Is part of this about the social friction of like the male principal walking in and staring at the female teacher? Is that a relevant constraint here to their information acquisition that they could have been doing ex ante? And then secondly, also in this theme of norms, the deservedness, it would be really interesting to unpack, maybe if it's possible to do a few more survey questions. How much of this, so I think what you varied in the vignette was, does his wife work or does her husband work, but not could she? Is it, and other work on that, not in education, but on this issue of deservedness, like Samreen Malik has some work on begging, for example, where, perceptions of the people giving to the beggars about whether is this person able to take up a job? Are they willing to take up a job? And if the giver knows that the beggar is willing to take up a job, they're willing to give more. So it sort of, I think, has implications where I think about, is this a norm where as the principal, I'm reinforcing, it's good his wife stays at home, let's keep enabling that, she shouldn't have to go out to the work? Or is it more like, they have small kids, it's gonna be really hard if she had to go out and work? Thanks.
Great question. Thank you so much. So on the self-selection point, so I think that at least because in this setting we can control for teacher value added, attendance, experience, some of the other pedagogy, I do think that that was definitely a possible explanation going into this, that it could just be that the male versus female teachers are different for lots of reasons. As you're saying, if I'm a married teacher and I still am a female teacher and I still am working, there could be a particular reason and that might translate into different productivity. Luckily, it didn't have to be the case, but when we look at the data, it does look like the male versus female teachers' productivity is very similar. And so at least in this case, I think that's not the driving the results, but it doesn't mean in other firms that wouldn't be at play. Imran, to your question, I think that I absolutely think it's kind of similar to this general kind of marriage boost. And what I would really love exactly is to look at this differential by gender. At least in our sample, we can't do it with our main RCT sample to separate out this, but we can do it in some of the vignette stuff. And so I think I can go back to that literature a little bit more too and see how similar like our premiums are to theirs. I think that would be very nice to do. And in the LEAPS data, we can do this as well too, to compare that marriage premium for men versus women. And also on the marriage premium, we can also basically look at, because the selection might be different, right? If I choose to stay in the labor market after I'm married, that's going to be different for men versus women. And so there's the combination of the selection component plus the kind of treatment effect of the bonus that managers might provide to households. I really like that idea of we don't have data on that to get at this kind of differential willingness, but I do think this is something that I'd like to hopefully do follow up on to try to understand exactly what is it that managers are trying to provide for? Is it that they want to maintain a certain status quo of kind of single earner male households, or is it that they just know exactly, oh, it's going to be hard because this family has young kids, these types of things? I think that would be really nice to understand, like what is it that managers are actually trying to maximize. In terms of the observation norms, I don't think that would have been important in our setting. They did still do typically like 2 observations per semester. It's more that I think what our treatment really did was we required the observations to be done without any notice. And so previously they were doing these kind of standard observations, but because they gave teachers notice, I think that like the quality of the observations was a little bit different. And that I think it was more just because that was the standard way that it was done in the schools. And so I think that us kind of adjusting that expectation was what was helpful in getting managers better information. I'm over time, so I'll wrap it up there, but thank you so much and happy to get more questions afterwards during the break too. Thank you.
And next up, we have Zahra Mansoor from the University of Bristol. We're very happy to have you here. And I give you the floor. And we have 30 minutes now for the next one.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Zahra. Thank you for having me here, and thank you to the organizers as well. Am I audible without the mic, by the way? Acha, sorry. Okay, I'll take the mic. Yes, so I'm doing a short presentation. I'm happy to take clarifying questions in the middle, if any, but I'll try to go on. I'll try to pause for questions in the middle, just to give you a chance to ask clarifying questions, and then we'll have questions in the end. All right, really happy to be here. I'm presenting work today on performance incentives for frontline workers and their supervisors. This is in the context of the Agriculture Extension Department in Punjab, and this is joint work with Garance Jenico and Ghazala Mansouri. So I'm going to get started. All right. So our motivation here is that we know that incentives can be especially relevant in bureaucracies where there are rigid rules when it comes to hiring, firing, and promotion flexibility. And now we know that there's considerable evidence which shows that that incentives can be effective in public sector settings. Yet designing these continues to be complex and difficult in public sector organizations. All right. So why is this the case? So firstly, when we think about the social planner, the objectives are elusive there, right? So, the social planner may care about welfare, but also equity and things like justice, which can be hard to quantify, which is why we'll see that many incentive designs tend to incentivize specific tasks or activities that workers or employees are doing. But even if we try to incentivize that, there are challenges. So firstly, there could be a challenge of multitasking, where we know that public sector jobs tend to have dimensions that are easy to measure, some that are difficult. We've been talking about schools, so think about public school teachers. It might be easy to measure whether the teacher is coming or not, but when we start thinking about the attitude of teachers with students, that might be more difficult to measure. And the final thing is that when we think about the public sector, service delivery doesn't just happen. Services are delivered in teams. So when we think about how services are delivered, we have to think about the hierarchy or the delivery chain through which incentives are getting delivered. So it's not just about workers, it's also about their supervisors and thinking about how we can incentivize them. So we're really thinking about incentive design that can account for these multi-layered complexities in public sector organizations. And when we think about kind of the core predictions there or kind of things that we could do, there are essentially 3 things here. So one could think about, let's say we're thinking about frontline workers, teachers, health workers, or in my context, extension workers. You could give them, you could design incentives based on objective metrics, but these would only target measurable tasks and leave out other unobservables. There's nothing for supervisors here. You could think about subjective incentives, which Christina was just talking about as well. The advantage here is that you can capture more nuance, but there's also risk of favoritism and misalignment and bias. And again, there's no incentives for supervisors. You could think about a third approach where supervisors could be incentivized in some way, which could actually do two things. It could incentivize them to give their complementary inputs into service delivery. And at the same time, they could give more kind of efficient evaluations. So there are these three things that could happen, potentially others as well. And despite these theoretical predictions, we don't really know how these things would play out in actual public sector settings and bureaucracies. There's still limited evidence on these. So what are we trying to do? So in this paper, we're going to try and study how performance incentives for both frontline staff and their immediate supervisors is going to affect service delivery, okay? So we're going to do this in collaboration with the Department of Agriculture here in Punjab, the Extension Department. And what we do is we implement an experiment in collaboration with them with 4 groups. The first group over here, this is the control group, so nothing changes over here, status quo. In the first treatment, we're going to have incentives for frontline workers based on objective metrics. There's going to be nothing for the supervisor here, no incentives. In treatment 2, the incentives for workers are going to be based on supervisor evaluations. So these are going to be subjective evaluations. Again, nothing for the supervisor. In the third treatment, we're going to again have subjective evaluations. But now think about the third kind of possible kind of mechanism that I was explaining, that you could introduce an incentive for supervisors which could align their complementary inputs and potentially could encourage them to make more effective evaluations. So that's what T3 is doing. It's combining the subjective incentives with the light touch monitoring of supervisors. I'm going to go into some more detail on these interventions, but these are essentially kind of the 3 treatment arms that we're going to have. And our research questions are exactly mapped to these treatment arms. So in the first question, we're interested in seeing what is going to be, what is going to be the impact of performance incentives based on objective metrics in improving extension, outreach, and quality. In the second question, we're interested in seeing the impact of these incentives on supervisor evaluations, which is the subjective treatment arm, in improving extension, outreach, and quality. And then in the third one, we want to understand if light touch oversight of supervisors, which we try to do in T3, can enhance the effectiveness of subjective incentives. Any questions, clarifying questions so far? Okay, great. So with this setup, I'm now going to give you a little bit more detail about the context, how we designed the experiment, and then go into the results. All right. So our context here, like I've said briefly, is the Punjab Agriculture Extension Department. Now, Punjab, as some of you will know, is home to 110 million people, nearly 5 million farm households. And extension frontline agents, which are called agriculture officers and field assistants, AOs and FAs, they are responsible for getting productivity information to smallholder farmers, which are about 60% of these 5 million farm households. So if we think about it, extension frontline providers are critical for improving yields of smallholder farmers, which continue to lag in Punjab. Our frontline extension workers here, FAs and AOs, as well as our immediate supervisors, ADs, they currently, when we started this work, they had non-existent incentives. So there was nothing there to incentivize them. And in addition, one piece of information that I don't have on the slides is that when we started working with the department, there was also no credible way of actually knowing what people were doing in the field. And again, this is a context where people go out in the field and they're the last mile service delivery agents. So they're going out in the field, they're doing a lot of outreach to villages, farmers, etc. So it's a context where it's difficult to get information as well. 2 additional features of the context which make the setting interesting for us is that agriculture extension is also a context where agents do many different things. Some of them are easier to measure versus others. So for example, trying to measure whether an FA or an AO has visited a village or a farmer is relatively easier to measure versus thinking, what is the attitude of this extension agent with a farmer? And ADs, who are their immediate supervisors, they meet with them on a weekly basis. So they're likely to have private information on these aspects. And finally, ADs, who are the immediate supervisors, they provide key complementary inputs. So they're not just managing staff over here, but they're doing things like assigning and planning their activities that they're supposed to do with farmers, which staff then go ahead and do. So in this context, they're not just monitoring their performance, they're also responsible for providing some of these inputs themselves. So all of these settings together make it an interesting setting to think about how would things change if we don't just think about incentives focused on workers only, but also include their supervisors. Another piece of context that I want to also quickly share with you is, so before this incentive program was rolled out, I've mentioned this briefly, but there was no way for the department to monitor what staff was actually doing. So we worked with the department to develop a system. This was called AgriSmart, and this was a two-part system. So through this system, FAs and AOs, who were frontline extension agents, they had an app. So they were going out to the field and they could record, the activities that we're doing. It was self-reported, but activities were geotagged, and there were a couple of checks in there to discourage misreporting. I'll get into that a bit when I get into the results. But for now, what I want you to know is that through this application, frontline staff were able to record what they were doing. And at the same time, their supervisors were given a dashboard, which was a management dashboard. And through this, they were able to do some of the key managerial tasks that they're supposed to do. For example, like I've already mentioned, planning and assigning farmer training programs to their staff. So through the system, we could then track how kind of these things panned out. All right. Any burning questions about the context? Yes. Yes.
Do the frontline workers know that their supervisors are receiving incentives?
Yes, they're aware, and they're also yeah. Just thinking back to the training that happened 5 years ago and exactly what information, but yes, they're aware. In the experiment, so this was in collaboration with the Extension Department, and it was across the entire province. So all 131 tehsils, some of you might be thinking this is different from the administrative number. These are extension tehsils, which are mainly in rural areas. So all 131 tehsils were assigned to our 3 different treatments and a control group. And essentially, this is what our sample looked like. So we had about 2,500 field assistants and agriculture officers. I have some summary statistics here, which are, I understand the text is really small, but the main takeaway message over here is that our sample was balanced across treatment arms. There was attrition in the sample. This is a department with where turnover tends to be relatively high. It was around 15-20%, but it was not correlated with any of the treatments. In terms of our interventions, so these are financial incentives, and they varied across 4 bonus levels. So one category was that you don't get anything. In the second category, you got a base bonus, which was around 7% of their monthly salary. The low bonus was 7% above the base, so about 14% of their monthly salary, and then the high bonus was 14% above the base. So all in all, these incentives, and they were given on a monthly basis. So these are not small numbers. I've alluded to the design a little bit, but I want to go into a bit more detail now. So in the objective arm, now that you know what AgriSmart is, bonuses were tied to objective metrics as captured by AgriSmart. So this included things like days worked, village visits, farmer training programs. If FAs and AOs met certain thresholds on these indicators, which were determined by the extension headquarters themselves, they could qualify for either of these categories. In the subjective arm,
supervisors could view these objective metrics on the dashboard, but without the thresholds. So they could see exactly how their staff was doing, but then they could use their own discretion to decide how much bonus to assign. In the subjective plus arm, exactly the same as T2, but the oversight that we added was that a tehsil level performance was produced for each AD, and this was shared with their divisional director and the headquarters. And the tehsil performance reports included kind of a summary of the AgriSmart performance, as well as the AD's own complementary inputs. So whether the AD had scheduled an FTP, which is Farmer Training Program, I'll use the short form from now on. So whether the AD scheduled an FTP or not, whether the AD was approving leaves for staff if they applied or not. So very simple metrics. We measured quite a few things. So our primary outcomes, these were in our questions as well. So we were concerned with extension outreach effort as our first primary outcome. So this is things like days worked, villages visited. We compute an outreach index based on all of these measures. There are a lot of different measures that the objective metrics were based on. So we measure our extension outreach effort. We also measured farmer outcomes. So this is farmer reported access to extension, as well as farmer knowledge of extension, and yield improvements. And we measured, finally, our third primary outcome was supervisor performance. So over here, by supervisor performance, what we're really interested in is whether the supervisor was making their key complementary inputs or not. Did they schedule an FTP? Did they approve leaves, and so on? And then in terms of the mechanisms, this is all kind of outlined, our treatment design, as well as why we think these mechanisms might be important. They're all outlined in our conceptual framework in the paper. So for those who are interested in those details, I would encourage you to go see it, and please give me feedback or questions. In the interest of time, I haven't been able to present that. So in terms of mechanisms, we're interested in extension quality. Now remember that in the objective arm, we're encouraging these measurable objective metrics. So one might imagine that does encouraging more effort on these dimensions crowd out quality? So is it that people are then just going to farmers one after the other, spending less time with them? You could think about extension, length of extension meetings as a proxy for quality. There are others as well. So over here, what we're interested in is whether extension quality is complementary or it gets crowded out in terms of the objective arm, as well as the others. We're also interested in how these different treatments will encourage effort on the extensive versus intensive staff margins. Do they just go to the same farmers and villages, or are they reaching out to more farmers and villages? And these two are of specific interest to us because in T3, remember, we introduced another layer of monitoring on the supervisors. So we're interested in seeing how their bonus allocation behavior is going to change. And we're also interested in seeing how their monitoring frequency is going to change. I'm just going to do a quick time check. All right. So today I'm going to present just the main effects and then give you an outline of things we find in the mechanisms. And I hope that will be enough for you to push me and give me suggestions on things that we are missing out. So let me just get started with the main effects. So the first thing that we find is that all treatments, the 3 treatment arms, they do improve extension outreach as measured by the AgriSmart metrics. So what you're seeing over here is an AgriSmart performance index, which is comprised of several different indicators, like days worked, hours worked, village visits. And you can see that as expected, the objective arm these are measured in standard deviation units. So you can see that the objective arm has the strongest effect here, but the subjective and subjective plus are also significant. There are some concerns here, right? Like, is this just reporting? Are the treatment arms just reporting more activities on AgriSmart? In the objective arm, are people just putting in enough effort to meet the threshold and then things drop off, in which case we would see bunching around the thresholds, at least in the objective arm? We rule out all of these concerns in the paper. One other thing that's interesting is that amongst all of these indicators, number of FTPs completed, this is only significant in subjective plus. And you can probably wonder why that is. But I'll come to this point later. But I just wanted to flag that in subjective plus, staff are doing close to 2 more farmer training programs compared to the other groups. So this is about extension outreach, right? We've seen that all treatment arms, they're improving extension outreach as measured by AgriSmart. But you might ask that, okay, Punjab is huge. So does a random farmer in Punjab experience this improved outreach? So for that, what we were interested in was, we were interested in understanding farmer access to extension for a random farmer who was not reported on the system. And to our luck, the department had actually gathered a very detailed farmer registration database that gave us access to a completely random data set of farmers. So we do several checks on that data set to be able to use this. But what we see next is, oops. Farmer access to extension. So what you're seeing over here is farmer access index. This is based on things like whether this random farmer that I just spoke about knows about the AOFA, whether they came to them, whether they had a meeting in the village. And over here, what you're seeing is, and again, this is normalized. So what you're seeing over here is that we don't really pick up any effects in the objective arm for this random farmer, but we do see significant effects in the subjective and the subjective plus arm. We try and explain these results. I apologize, this is a little small, but I'll just talk through it. So what our data seems to tell us is that, as you would expect, the objective arm is encouraging more effort on the intensive margin. So they seem to be going to the existing client base more versus the subjective arms. In the subjective arms, we're seeing more evidence of effort on the extensive margin, especially in the case of the subjective plus arm. So over here, what you're seeing is the number of times a single farmer is repeated. Now, on the AgriSmart database, we have records of farmer phone numbers, farmers that were visited. So we are able to compute the number of times a farmer is repeated. And over here, what you're seeing is that the objective arm is more likely, they visit the same farmer at least like about 3.2 more times versus the control arm. The number is smaller in subjective and even smaller in subjective plus, and these are significantly different as well, the objective arm compared to the two arms. This is total farmers reached. Okay, all treatment arms are reaching out to more farmers, but when we specifically look at farmers reached out for farmer training programs, which is a key extension activity for mobilizing new farmers, getting them into the fold, we're only seeing effects on the extensive margin in subjective and subjective plus. Subjective plus here is not significantly different from the subjective arm in terms of total farmers reached. But when we look at total villages that were reached for farmer training programs, that's only subjective and subjective plus. So what does this mean? This essentially means is that subjective plus is going out to more villages compared to the other arms, significantly more villages, we can rule that out, and they're reaching out to more farmers in these unique villages as well. And finally, the last primary outcome that I spoke about was supervisors. We wanted to see what is it that was happening with the supervisors. So we look at two main outcomes. FTPs that were assigned to staff. So this is planning, right? These are managers. They plan the number of farmer training programs each farmer is supposed to do. So we do find that in subjective plus, supervisors are assigning about to higher FTPs to about 6 to 7% of the staff. 6 to 7% of more staff compared to the other arms are assigned FTPs in subjective plus. And this is, again, significantly different from the objective and the subjective arm. Any questions before I will wrap up in 2 minutes, so we have time for questions. Yes?
So this is the learning, about 5 months data, right?
There is learning.
What direction can you give us
are you talking about learning for the supervisors?
both for the supervisors as well as?
So the effects are pretty consistent month by month. In the paper, I show quarter by quarter effects. But in subjective plus, what's really interesting is that the reports were introduced about four months after the treatments were rolled out. because there was some kind of administrative delay. So when I exploit that variation, I actually see that all the subjective plus results kick in once these reports were introduced. And these reports were pretty light touch. Like it wasn't, there weren't any direct incentives here. It was light touch monitoring. So that's something we can see. But in terms of the month by month, quarter by quarter effects, pretty consistent, I would say. So in the mechanisms in the paper right now, I'm sorry, this is actually, let me just reduce this text so I don't take up too much of your cognitive bandwidth. But in the mechanism section that we have in the paper right now, we're really trying to understand how subjective plus was working. And you might have a lot of questions. Like I just said, these reports were really light touch. So you might say, okay, were they even legitimate? What is the legitimacy of these reports in the department? And we're able to show through survey data that about 80%, more than 80% of the ADs said it's important to seniors. And actually half of the ADs in this treatment said that their seniors, who were the directors, they took action based on the reports that were shared with them. We don't really see any effects on supervisors' own monitoring behavior. They don't go into subjective plus and make more field visits, but we are seeing that they're using the dashboard more. We can show this, and it's significantly more than at least the subjective arm. In terms of the allocation patterns, there's a lot of literature that talks about, how in subjective schemes, there's a centrality bias, a leniency bias. Supervisors will just give more money to everyone. We do see this. The subjective arms do give out higher bonuses on average compared to the objective arm. So yeah, that's kind of another finding that is the case because cost effectiveness is important in these discussions. Just wanted to put that out here. And the final piece, is the bonus allocation criteria. We were really interested in understanding how the subjective and subjective plus supervisors were assigning bonuses. And we can use data on staff, their agri-smart performance, their personality, their kind of caste and other things to really do some prediction here. So in the objective arm, bonuses are mainly driven by agri-smart, which you would expect. In the subjective and subjective plus arm, the agri-smart indicators are still important, but other things become important too. So in the subjective arm, we're seeing that they are significantly putting more weight on experienced and their shared Zat. The shared Zat between the extension agent and the supervisor. In subjective plus, we see other things. There is greater weight on FTPs being completed compared to both the objective and the subjective arm. They also seem to value staff personality type more. So we measured the BFI index for staff and the BSM index. And apparently the BFI index, that seems to predict bonuses in subjective plus. And we don't see any reliance on social ties in the subjective plus arm. Shared caste does not seem to matter. So in sum, we do find that the objective arm is the most effective in improving extension outreach. There's no negative effects on length of extension activities, which is our proxy for quality. However, outreach has mainly improved for the existing client base. In subjective plus, we're seeing effects on outreach and quality and outreach to a larger set of farmers. And this effect is mainly coming from the middle managers. They're making their supervisory inputs, they're scheduling FTPs, something that you would imagine they would do in any case. So they're scheduling more FTPs, which seems to be a clearer kind of mechanism. But at the same time, we do have evidence that they are making more kind of, efficient, I would say, bonus allocations as well, and they're using their discretion effectively. So the key takeaways for us over here for incentive design in these settings is that light touch oversight incentives for supervisors, or just including them when you're thinking about incentive design, can improve field performance and also reduce social bias, especially if you're thinking of subjective incentives. And in this context, at least, unmonitored discretion, it seems to kind of suggest that social ties will be preferred. But I want to end with this important point that there are trade-offs. The objective arm does improve outreach. There's no negative effects on quality, and it is more cost-effective. On the other hand, subjective plus is improving outreach. We're seeing they're going out to more farmers, but it's twice as expensive. So these are kind of ultimately decisions that need to be made in terms of cost effectiveness as well. I'm going to stop here, and yeah, happy to take questions.
So, Zahra, my, I mean, I just wanted to kind of, I was thinking through what to make of it. A great presentation. But in some sense, if you could have yields, because at the end of the day, the measure of quality of extension services is it having an effect on farmer productivity? And that I think has to be grounded at some level. Otherwise, it's unclear to me, it could be just two different objective functions. So, sort of in the objective arm, the field people feel these are the nodes through which we trade and then knowledge could spread. And you have supervisors who think that, you just spread the same people over more people. But what's going to have an impact on yield would be, I think, important.
My question, it's a great presentations, and the BOR, the Board of Revenue, the agriculture sector, and especially economic sector about there. 90.2% the contribution of the GDP from the agriculture. But there is a question is to relevance MOSAs, Tehsils, DC deputy commissioners, additional commissioners, and all the commissioners and secretary also. The agriculture sector is not aligned. We should try to align first of all, and then we should try to enhance the capabilities of the farmers. Why the governments try to abolish the Lombardari system? In the few past decades, if we try to check out the facts and figures in the past. And the most important factor is there, supervisor and ADs, assistant directors and deputy directors, and agriculture sectors. Also, we should try to enhance the capabilities and using the KPIs. And also, government is using the KPIs, but need to enhance the effectiveness, cost efficiency in this sector. Ji, thank you.
Hi, this is just a comment. So, in our similar work, the intervention of Punjab government in health sector, especially in immunization, we have seen all the great results, but all the results were driven by the urban areas. So further aggravating the health inequality between rural and urban. So there we found that it's not the policies or the intervention, it's how the operational and managerial staff navigate these policies. And in our case, it was navigated by going to the more accessible areas. So it would be interesting if you could somehow show or see that the similar, I suspect that similar effect might be here as well, that the resources are shifted to more accessible areas just to show government that the KPIs are improving. Thanks.
Hello, excellent presentation and very thought provoking. I work in a public sector company. So my fundamental and basic question is, because we face this question every day, why incentive? Because if a person is appointed for a certain job, and what is happening now when I'm observing in my organization, our organization, and some other government entities, people don't work till they get the incentive. So they are getting the salary, they think that that is their right, and they wait for the incentive to work. So I just wanted to understand, what is your understanding or philosophy why you think that incentive is necessary when that person is hired to do a certain job? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try to wrap up, Annabelle, as quickly as I can. So Ali, I'm really glad you asked the yield question. I wanted to add a slide on that, but well, in short, we do have data on yield. We don't see any results there on yield. And in the paper, perhaps it would be really great to get your thoughts during tea or something on this. So we don't observe any effects on yields. The coefficients are all in the right direction in the subjective plus arm, but they're insignificant. And our kind of, what we think is going on is as follows. So when we started this program, we mainly designed the program to incentivize employee effort. And obviously you would imagine that the reason why we're doing that is because the expectation is they go out, they work hard, and eventually that leads to the outcome we care about, which is yield. Now the issue in this particular context is that extension department has information on productivity, the leaflets, which are close to 30, 40 years old. So the reason why we started working with the department was because there was an agreement that while we work on the incentive performance management side, they will be updating all of their content to make that more relevant, timely. This also goes to your point, right? Like you have to improve the skills of the farmers, so you have to give them the right information. That never took off. So we are getting people out into the field. They're working harder, but it's really questionable whether the information that they're giving is actually timely, relevant to drive those improvements. So that's the first kind of reason why we think the effects are, not there. The other is that we only have data on yield 1.5 years after the treatment. So maybe the effects have not kind of come through. So we do have that data. It's discussed in the paper, but unfortunately, we don't really pick anything up there. I think I've partly responded to your question about improving the skills of farmers. I completely agree. That's something we need to think about as well. And I do know that there is now a lot of work that is happening in the department. I think SERP is doing some work on that, right? So there's work happening there. So to your question, we did stratify by tehsil. So I think that takes care of your concern. So within a tehsil, which is a certain area, locality, we have both treatment and control groups. So we don't think the effects are driven by things like, geography or location. And finally, I think you're asking a big philosophical question, which is kind of like, should you incentivize workers because your theory is that they don't work hard and their incentives are not aligned with the objectives of the principle, or should we think about, their intrinsic motivation? So there's a lot of work by Dan Honig and some others who now think about bureaucrats as mission-driven bureaucrats. And their argument is that actually, we need to harness these skills and, we need to give bureaucrats more autonomy and things like that to improve their performance. So there's debates out there. I'm not saying incentives is the way forward. There are other theories as well. And I guess the empirical literature is out there to see how everything pans out. Thank you, everyone, for your time and your questions. And happy to take more.
Last but not least one in this session is Torsten Figueiredo from the NYU Abu Dhabi, who's going to talk about data collection and endogenous sample selection. It's good to have you here, Torsten.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here. So this paper is entitled Endogenous Sample Selection. And And it's joint work with Niklas Monike from Oxford University, and it was supported by a very large set of research assistants from all over the world. If you have any questions, especially clarifying questions as I go, please feel free to interrupt me. Now, in many ways, this paper is a little bit different from the two previous presentations, because here I'm going to think about data production in a global setting. Okay, so this paper is really about human data production, and it focuses on the incentives faced by data collectors. We think this is a really important topic because human collected data is ubiquitous. A lot of the data that we use to inform policy and for research is collected by humans. Think of survey data, think of police records, medical records, and so on and so forth. Now, when we use this data for analysis, we typically do so under the premise that the data has been collected following a specific protocol. But human data collectors react to incentives, and their incentives may not always be aligned with the data collection protocols. So deviations may arise, and these can take forms that interfere with subsequent analysis. In this paper specifically, we focus on sampling. Sampling is a very fundamental part of any data collection exercise. And in theory, there is a protocol that determines very clearly who will be included in the sample and who won't. But in practice, data collectors often have substantial influence over who is included and who is excluded. And thus, they may actually be tempted to exclude subjects that are of very high cost to them, and in some sense of low benefit to them, which then in turn may invalidate the analysis we do because it may lead to endogenously selected samples. Let me make this very illustrative with one example. So this is the household roster from the Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey in Togo in 2006. The Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey is a sister program of the well-known DHS, Demographic and Health Survey, and is mainly focused on women and young children. The survey proceeds in two steps. First, data collectors visit households that have been sampled. And at the door of the household, they then list all the household members in a roster. And so as you can see here, they will go through and they're going to fill in their names, their gender, and their age. And after that, they have to determine whether these individuals are eligible for an additional long individual questionnaire, here specifically about women between 15 and 49 and children under the age of 5. Okay, and so essentially what they do here, they have to circle those eligible individuals. Now this makes it very salient to them. Check, this person is going to be a lot of work. Check, this person is going to be a lot of work. How much work? Well, this is one way in which you can think about this. So what I'm plotting here is for women on the left and men on the right, the average number of questions that have to be asked by age. Okay, and so what you can see is there is a long questionnaire for children under the age of 5, so they have to ask about 100 questions for those ages. And there is an individual woman's questionnaire that also has a lot of questions, okay? Interestingly, in the survey for men, there's no individual questionnaire. Now, what does the resulting age distribution in the data look like? This is what we get, and I think there is, in some sense, the message from the paper is all in here. So let me make a few observations. So first, you will see there are a lot of spikes at round numbers in this data. This is not the focus of the paper. This is something that has been observed before in a lot of data from low and middle income countries. Instead, what I want you to focus on is the missing mass that we see basically in the eligible ages and the excess mass just outside. So we see it for children, for both genders, and we see it for women. We clearly have more women here at the ages just above 49 and below 15, but we have less on the other side of the threshold. And then, maybe this is best seen if you sit far back, there seems to be a general depression of the age distribution for this entire age range here. So this is suggesting that two things are happening. One, data collectors are manipulating the age of household members such that they fall outside the eligible range. Two, they entirely omit household members from the roster so they don't have to basically work through the individual questionnaire. And then finally, importantly, we don't see any such pattern for the men, suggesting that there's indeed a causal link between the design of the survey and this pattern. Now, in the paper more broadly, we asked 3 questions. 1, do data collectors systematically exclude subjects? 2, is the resulting selection of subjects out of sample non-random? And 3, how does that affect inference and analysis? We provide evidence from a total of 181 surveys across 73 countries, where we show that data collectors indeed manipulate survey samples by excluding subjects that are of high cost to them, where they have to ask a lot of questions. This in turn leads to non-random selection of subjects out of sample and introduces systematic bias, both in aggregate statistics and in economic analysis that builds on this data. Finally, while we mainly work with the mix and the DHS, we show that this is a widespread phenomenon that is present in a lot of the data that we as economists use very frequently. How do we contribute to the literature? So I see this as linking mainly to two streams of literature. One is on selection in surveys, which goes back to Rubin in 1976 at least. And this literature has mainly focused on non-response bias. Here we document that there is another margin of selection, namely that data collectors are screening out respondents. And we demonstrate what the implications of this are for inference and economic analysis. And note, in some dimensions, this may be worse than non-response bias because this is typically unobserved, whereas non-response is something that we know who did not respond. Secondly, we link to a large literature on the design and implementation of data collection. This literature is mainly focused on how characteristics of data collectors affect data quality and the incentives that respondents face. What we do is we highlight how the design and implementation of surveys shape the incentives of the data collectors. Are there any questions before I go into a little bit more detail? Okay, if not, let me go ahead. So we work with two of the largest international household survey programs, the Demographic and Health Survey and the Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey. I think in this audience, most people will be familiar with these surveys, but let me just say they're very heavily used in social sciences and beyond. So economics is actually only a very small share of the use of this data. They're important for policy because SDGs, aid flows, national plans for health, etc., are conditioned on them, and they cover almost all low and middle income countries around the world. They proceed in two steps, just like in the initial example that I gave you. They always have a so-called screening or household roster first, where they collect basic information, especially demographics. And these demographics then determine the eligibility for long individual questionnaires that are collected in the second stage. What does long mean in our context? So in the context, or specifically in our data set, the average number of questions for an eligible woman will be 261 and 140 for an eligible man. So these are really long questionnaires. How are these surveys implemented? So while the mix and the DHS are designed with the aid of UNICEF and USAID, are or were, they are implemented locally, most commonly by national statistical offices. And this means that the contracts of data collectors vary across contexts, but like we've spoken to many statistical offices, and essentially the standard way of doing this is hiring temporary workers and paying them a fixed daily wage. What's important in this setting, though, is that there is a schedule set in advance, and adherence to that schedule is important. So that's something the offices really value, because data collectors have to move from one location to another in a pre-scheduled way, and so those delays become really costly. Now, how do we estimate the extent to which individuals go missing from the data? We exploit the fact that in 181 surveys, there is a random assignment of a man's questionnaire across households. So only in every second or every third household, the DHS or the mix are actually going to implement a men's questionnaire, and this is randomly assigned. So in total, this gives us random assignment across 3.4 million households in all the countries that you see here on the map. We compare basically how many eligible men you have in households where a men's questionnaire is administered to households where it's not administered. How does this look from the side of the data collector. So when the data collector approaches the household, they will open the questionnaire, and there will be a pre-specified field which will tell them whether the household is eligible or has been selected for the male questionnaire. And then as they go to the roster, if the household is selected, they will have to mark the men of the eligible age range. So again, it's very salient for them who is quote unquote in the treatment group. And then we estimate the amount of missing men of eligible age across all 181 surveys. You can see those estimates here ranging from 0 to almost 25%, with an average of 6.5%, and about 3/4 of surveys that have a statistically significantly negative estimate here. Now, this is a conference where gender is an important topic, so I won't have time to show those results, but we have similar results for women that are less well identified, but they look very similar in terms of magnitudes. Now, we can then disentangle a little bit and provide evidence of what is going on. So here I'm showing you again in black the effect on eligible men, but in red I'm showing you the effects on men that are of ineligible age. So they are just outside this 15 to 59 age range. And you can see almost all of those estimates are positive. So this is suggesting they are indeed manipulating the age, displacing them. But often in absolute terms, the red estimates are not as large as the black ones. So that's evidence that they're, in addition to displacing the age, also write out omitting household members. And in the paper, we do this entire exercise more formally. Now, the next important question is, who goes missing? Are the people that we are losing in this way randomly selected, or do they differ from the ones that remain in the data? Okay, we do not observe the missing people because they're not in the data, but we can compare the average characteristics of men in households that do and do not have a men's questionnaire. And so what you can see is that in households that do have a men's questionnaire, those men are less likely to be poor, distantly related to the household head, unmarried, and chronically ill. Okay, so these are exactly the type of men that are going missing. And we summarize this as saying it seems like it's the marginal household members that go missing. Now, let me go into applications and implications. So, why and how does this matter for economic analysis? Well, first, I think it's straightforward that this reduces sample size and that will cost us precision. But much more importantly, the non-random selection of individuals out of the sample can lead to bias. Okay, and so in the paper we have 3 applications that we discuss to provide evidence on how this may affect analysis. The first one is about climate shocks in sub-Saharan Africa, the second about the firm size distribution in India, and the third is about the gender gap in US youth employment. I'm not going to cover the third today for time reasons. So when economists study climate shocks, they often run a specification of this sort. They regress some outcome in a location I at time t on a climate shock, as well as location and time fixed effects. Okay, and so here we have a list of papers that follow this approach and look at a big range of different outcomes. Now, we replicate this style of analysis and we look at droughts as a climate shock. And so this figure summarizes what we find. So first note, we pick 2 outcomes here, whether or not a man is married and whether he has any children below the age of 1 in their household, which is a proxy for fertility. Now, we are limited in the choice of outcomes here because we can only do this for outcomes that are observed for men in households with and without an individual questionnaire. Okay, so the outcomes essentially have to be collected as part of the roster for us to be able to do this. Now we compare basically the households that do have an individual questionnaire, a men's questionnaire, to the households that do not. Okay? And so what you can see very clearly is that in the data where there is an individual questionnaire, and this is the data that is typically used for this analysis, because it has the wealth of outcomes for the individuals, we get a statistically significant negative effect of drought on the outcome. And this is true for both of the outcomes. However, when we look at the part of the data that doesn't have an individual questionnaire, we don't see anything like this. So we are basically asking, look, are we capturing spurious effects here? The problem is fundamentally that even if your climate shock is exogenous, your sample composition is likely reacting to the climate shock as well, because the climate shock will affect the conditions on the ground. And so, we have this in more detail in a table. We see that the amount of people that are missing from the data changes, the selection is changing, and that seems to be driving this coefficient. Now, the second application comes from a completely different context. So, so this goes beyond the DHS and the mix, and we, generally we want to make the point, look, this is not about the DHS or the mix. I could show you figures from labor force surveys, household expenditure surveys, and so on and so forth. You will often see those spikes at cutoffs where people become eligible for more questions. So this affects a lot of data, and it also affects firm census data. So this is data from the Indian economic census in 2005. And what you can see very clearly is that there's a discontinuity in the distribution here at 10. Now, in the existing literature, this jump down in the distribution has been linked to labor regulation in India, because there's a lot of regulations that kick in at 10. But if you go into the kind of manual for the data collectors, you will find that for firms above this size, they had to fill in an extra schedule. Okay, so this could be a competing explanation for this jump. Now, if I go back to 1998 and look at the economic census in that year, you see no such pattern. Okay, here, if anything, I have round number bunching at 10, but I certainly don't have this jump down. Now, interestingly, the labor regulations were all in place in 1998 already. So this is really suggesting it's the incentives for the data collectors that are driving this. And if this doesn't convince you, let me give you 2013, when they shifted the threshold from 10 down to 8, and you see how the distribution follows. Okay, so the idea is that it's really important to factor in what the incentives of data collectors are and how that will distort the conclusions we draw from the data. Now, there is a lot more things that I could talk about, and I don't know how can I click on any of my buttons? If you can click for me on the mechanisms button, it would be very helpful. Thank you. So one, additional piece of work that we do to dig a little bit into the mechanisms is to try to understand, okay, under which conditions is this phenomenon worse? And so one, we exploit variation within enumerator across adjacent days in the temperature. And what we find is that here, measured in wet bulb temperature in degrees Fahrenheit, on hot days, you have more missing people. Okay, suggesting that, okay, effort cost is higher on those days, you're going to try to work less. We also have a comparison across surveys, so, this is truly merely a correlation that suggests, though, that when you implement audits, so mandatory re-interviewing, this problem becomes less. It's not entirely eliminated, but it's not as severe. And could you? Thank you. And then, obviously this opens up a lot of questions regarding, okay, what can we do about this? Okay, so in the paper we have a discussion which is about, can we correct for this ex post? So given that we know that a lot of our data suffers from this, what can we do about it? I mean, one thing that is very clear, randomization, as in this case of the DHS, is very valuable because at least it allows you to identify the problem in the first place. Otherwise, you use the data and you're not even aware how many people you might be losing and the bias you might have. Now, we do an exercise where we basically reweight the data using observables to correct for this. At the end of the day, it's kind of along the lines of what you would expect. Things shift in the right direction, but they don't fully undo the selection. We also then turn to, okay, what could you do ex ante? And we examine whether surveys that have tablets or field check tables suffer less from this. Now, the sad news is that no. And, I think it really depends on how you leverage those tablets and field check tables when you implement those surveys. If people have a tablet, but you don't use the control functions that it enables, it's hard for it to actually make a difference. Now, I do have time to show one more thing, right?
You have about 2 minutes for the presentation and then 5 minutes for questions.
Okay, so if we can quickly click on non-response, please. So one other issue that I think is interesting is that, we often think of non-response being less of an issue in low and middle income countries than in high income countries. Now, in the data, we actually find that this endogenous sample selection seems to be more pronounced in poorer countries. And here what I'm showing you is essentially the sum of the two. So blue is non-response and red is endogenous sample selection. And you see that in magnitude, they're roughly the same. But in total, we're suddenly missing many more people than we thought. Plus, as I mentioned initially, non-response is something that we always knew about. This was until now fundamentally unobserved, and in many contexts, the design of the survey doesn't allow us to quantify this. Thank you. And yeah, if we then can move to the next slide. This I can do myself again, you're right. So let me conclude here. I think in economics, we have spent a long time thinking very hard about identification. We have made massive progress in the last 25 years. But for valid causal inference, we need both good data and identification. And I think we're still at the beginning of really understanding very deeply how data production processes work. In this paper, we take a first step into that direction. We show that data collectors screen out survey subjects that require disproportionate effort. That leads to endogenous selection of samples and biased inference, and is a widespread phenomenon that affects a lot of the data we use for our work. More broadly, it highlights that there is an information bias trade-off when we design data collection. Right? The more questions we ask, the higher is kind of the degree to which we're losing the people that we might be most interested in, right? Like here, for example, the marginal women and men. Thank you.
Hi, Torsten. My name is Mohammed Malik, and I happen to run the data collection for the projects that you are doing in Pakistan. So my only comment is that isn't the solution very simple, where we kind of incentivize enumerators in a way that if they're going for longer questionnaires, they incentivize more. To be honest, we're stuck in a situation which is kind of reverse, where we give them more money for longer questions, so they want to stay in one household and not move. So we have a reverse kind of a problem over there. And what are your comments on that? And hopefully you'll continue. And this presentation was not about our data collection.
Yeah, let me collect 2 or 3.
Great paper and very interesting results. I am wondering whether you have variation in terms of the number of questions, just to see whether, like, if it's a monotonic relationship, or maybe there is like some number of additional questions that should not make that difference in terms of the endogenous selection of the sample, or if it's like just any additional question is gonna to actually increase that selection. Thank you.
There's someone behind you. No, I think yeah, over there and over there.
Okay, so my question is that you talked about the data collectors and on the screen. I just want to know that whether we need to incentivize those people who are filling the questionnaires and who are filling the those surveys forms, and when we are going to incentivize them, what kind of incentive should that be? Whether it be something, you know, on monetary terms, or whether that should be something in, you know, food terms or something like that.
Okay, thank you. Let me answer those three. So first, Mohammed, thank you for this question. And I think it relates very much to the last question as well. It's not straightforward how you write a contract that will solve this problem. Because, you know, like one question we often get is like, but shouldn't we just pay them per interview? But, you know, actually a few, like five or six of the mix and DHS have tried this, and you get the opposite problem. People will invent fake respondents, right? And it's very hard to control this. Now, I think the audits are one promising avenue. The thing is, for the audit, the age manipulation is something that is, you know, more auditable than, I guess, the outright omission of household members, because it's very hard to kind of, you know, set it up in a way that the data collector cannot deny and say, look, that person wasn't there, or they didn't tell me about this person when I first went there. So now, you know, more anecdotally, other things that might work. So for example, based on the firm census in Ghana, where we don't see any patterns similar to those in India, the key difference is they send two different teams to do the screening and the actual data collection with a 3 months gap. And that brings other problems, because you need to find exactly those same firms again. But, you know, you're, you know, basically here separating the responsibilities, and that might be one way forward. More generally, I think, yes, there are ways to solve this. These ways are costly. And I think one interesting question now is to think about, okay, essentially as the designer of the data collection, I face a trade-off. How much bias am I willing to accept? How much do I want to pay to reduce this bias? Or do I want to use those same resources, for example, to increase my sample size and have higher precision? Right? And I think that's an interesting question for future work. Then about the number of questions. So we do have variation in this, but the variation is only across surveys, right? And lots of other things are changing across surveys as well. So it's a little bit hard for us to say much about, you know, what kind of, you know, I guess the curvature of that function would look like. In some cases, we can look at men and women in the same survey. So there's 3 cases where both the men's and the women's questionnaires randomly assigned. And the elasticities that we find, despite different, you know, numbers of questions, are very similar. So I think that it's a lot about, okay, is this very salient? Okay, there's a lot more work that makes the difference, rather than whether it's 105 or 110 questions. But again, you know, we can't speak that much to this yet. Imran?
I was just going to make that point about sort of doing the survey in 2 stages. That's one way that we've tried to address this problem. Just have a very short sort of almost like roster. Use that to identify who you want to come back to actually interview. But obviously there's trade-offs with the possibility to lose people. The other question I had was, like, when we give people instructions, like household members instructions, do we have variation when people are aware that certain people are going to be interviewed in greater detail? and whether we have endogenous selection from the households or endogenous entry driven by the households, and whether we can compare that to that behavior of the enumerators.
Okay, yeah.
Kind of building on Imran's first point, what about sort of just getting people to call back? That's another cheaper way to audit rather than sending out teams, sort of in advance, particularly for things like household attributes and stuff. You could just do cheap audits through callback systems and so on.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, the rest of the discussion will be tea break then. So you can
Okay. Thanks. So to Imran's question, kind of endogeneity on the selection of households. So in this setting, the households, I mean, these are not panel surveys. They're collected only every 5-ish years in a given country. So it's very unlikely that the households know how the survey works. Plus, it's randomly assigned in which household there will be a men's questionnaire. So, we very much argue, look, the household cannot really play any role in the selection here. It has to come from the side of the enumerator or the data collector because they know ex ante, how the entire survey works. I don't know if
there's variation of that, you can validate it. It doesn't have to be a panel for me to make this is either going to be more time costly for me to answer these questions or not.
Yeah, so I mean, happy to talk more about this afterwards. I don't think we have that variation because, those things are highly standardized by the DHS unless they made like some significant changes from one wave to another in this. And I don't also know how much of that material is easily publicly accessible. Thank you. And then about the callbacks, yeah, I totally agree that that is an option. And, I don't know for sure in all of those contexts where we measure audit, that basically what we do is we read the reports and they say we conducted mandatory re-interviewing, but they don't provide any details of this. We connected with the DHS and the mix and we said, okay, do you actually have the data on this? Can we look at, what's coming back? But that data does not get centralized. So it stays in the national statistical offices. And I think it's barely ever used for analysis. So, again, I would love to do more in that direction. Okay, thank you very much. I think I'm between you and lunch, so.